Welcome back to episode 14 of the Rugby History Project. I'm your host Hattie, and today we're looking at a brief early history of women's rugby in the USA. How a counterculture movement and a landmark civil rights case created the first World Cup winners. In the autumn of 1972, two groups of Colorado University students unwittingly started a movement, providing queer and straight women a safe space to play a full contact sport. This was a direct response to a vulgar display of misogyny they had witnessed over a year previously, and buoyed by a landmark civil rights case. This is the tale of the women who refused to go away. In 1971, those who attended Aspen Ruggerfest were treated to a powder puff rugby match. Exhibition American football matches played by teenage girls are a tradition at many American high schools. The games are meant to be a spectacle, as feminine girls take on a masculine sport they've not trained for. The aim of the powder puff rugby match was to entertain the crowd, who'd gather to watch men's rugby. However, the match greatly irritated University of Colorado Boulder student Trudy Foreman and her friends. Inspired, the group decided to play the sport. Female students from both the University of Colorado Boulder and Colorado State University began training in earnest, and just over a year later, the two teams met for their first game. This was not the first ever serious women's rugby match in the United States. Previous games had been held in the late 1960s. It is, however, the first game that could be linked to the continuous movement that still exists today. The Colorado students who took up rugby were part of a much greater non-rugby movement taking place in the United States during the late 60s and 70s. The college system was expanding at rapid speed, with a larger proportion attending tertiary institutions of learning than ever before. Specifically, the number of women attending college increased dramatically. Between 1960 and 1975, the percentage of female high school graduates attending college increased from 37% to 49%, whilst the overall number of young women graduating high school almost doubled in the same period. With the increase in women in tertiary education and inspired by the wider civil rights movements of the era, legislation to combat widespread sexism came into being. Title IX did not start life as a sports-based bill. Originally, Title IX came into being in response to the exclusion of education and academia from previous executive orders which prevented sex-based discrimination. However, during the long process to get the law signed, it became clear that sports would become a huge part of Title IX. Whilst the original aim of Title IX was to prevent the preferential treatment men received in programme admissions and academic job applications, the broad language used in the Act meant that it could be easily applied to athletics. Athletics had always been a huge part of the American collegiate system. Originally based on the ideals of muscular Christianity, major men's team sports such as football, basketball and baseball had become major cultural phenomena which could produce revenue for their institution. In 1972, women made up 42% of college students, but only 1% of college athletic budgets went to women's sports programs. Under pressure from the main governing body of collegiate athletics, the NCAA, which generally opposed the legislation, as well as women's sports advocates, the vague language of the Title IX was clarified through further guidelines for all levels of education. In light of concerns about effects of truly equal access to women's sports from football advocates, it was decided that institutions would be judged on a school-wide basis rather than on individual teams, while skill was a criterion when deciding which sports would be offered to women at a varsity or NCAA level. Women would be granted equal opportunities and accommodations to play sports alongside with equitable funding. Title IX's impact on sports was revolutionary, but by design and implementation, it has never provided truly equal opportunities and funding to women and men's sports. Whilst Title IX has never been perfect, it did bring the concept of women playing sport to the forefront. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. Rugby had been reintroduced to American colleges in the late 1950s. A club sport, rugby was seen as a pastime rather than a more serious varsity sport such as football or basketball. For club sports, skill was not deemed a criterion in participation, and they were not governed by the NCAA. Title IX would go on to become a significant distinction in the development of women's rugby in the United States in comparison to their international counterparts. Title IX had not only brought women's sports to the forefront, but as rugby was a club sport and therefore no apparent skill delineation could be used to stop women from playing it, any of the possible minimal funding given to a men's rugby team by an educational institution was in theory required to be given to a women's team, if one existed, at the same institution. In the 5 years following the 1972 Colorado game, 109 women's rugby teams had been formed across the United States. 2 years later, 210 teams were in existence, primarily based at either universities or in university towns. Despite this, female rugby players had no representation within USA Rugby until 1979, despite the union only being formed in 1975. In 1979, Alyssa Orgello, better known as Jello, took the revolutionary step of bringing together representatives from the 4 geographic regions of American rugby to form the USA Women's Rugby Committee. Due to apathy from the men in charge of USA Rugby, the Women's Committee were largely independent and free to do as they pleased. Due to their official membership of USA Rugby, female rugby players were forced to pay dues to both their national and regional unions, but outside of the Women's Committee, they had no representation at any level. As one administrator is quoted as saying by Carrie Heffernan in her 2026 book No Advantage Given, "We just thought you'd go away." On the pitch, USA Women's Rugby was perhaps the most developed in terms of competitions and tournaments. Regional and territorial competitions fed into the national championships from 1978. However, the large geographic area which these contests covered meant that unsafe playing conditions were frequent. With long travel distances required and players working around work and study commitments, multiple games were often played across only a few days. Portland, Maine won the first national championships in 1978, playing 4 games in just 2 days, according to player Mary Beth Matthews. Domestic travel was not the only travel female American rugby players undertook. American women were the first to undertake international rugby tours. American women's rugby teams began international touring in 1977. However, in 1979, a Midwest representative side travelled to Great Britain, ostensibly to play British teams. Unfortunately, the Midwestern side were unable to organise any matches with British sides and simply ended up playing each other. The San Diego-based Rio Grande Surfers were perhaps one of the most well-travelled teams, with documented tours to Aotearoa, New Zealand and Great Britain, along with an infamous trip to Ireland thanks to a sexist prank by male Trinity College players in 1983. International women's rugby had begun in 1982, but was confined to Western continental Europe with infrequent one-off games. The Wyverns Tour of 1985 were the first women's American representative side, although not officially recognised by USA Rugby. Touring Great Britain in agreement with the Women's Rugby Football Union, as well as France, the Wyverns Tour not only showed European rugby fans what women's rugby could be, but also how far behind European women were. The USA side dominated their opponents during their 2-week tour, and the games made national newspapers in Britain. The first representative side to use the USA moniker, although not the USA Rugby Eagles branding, was the 1986-87 side. Brought together for training camps in 1986 and playing their first test match in 1987, the USA women's national team was officially born. In the 4 years between their first test match and their Rugby World Cup win, the USA played just a handful of games against Canada and 3 games in Aotearoa in 1990 as a part of Rugby Fest. Despite being part of a non-traditional newer national union, the national team faced significant backlash from their own rugby community. The most notable and significant pushback came after the team's first international test. An unofficial doubleheader with their male counterparts, the USA women's side were victorious, whilst their male counterparts had failed to overcome the Canucks. In a joint post-match banquet organised by Rugby Canada, the USA men's captain, Fred Powley, used his mic time to denounce women's rugby and criticise the fact that the wives of the USA men's team had not been invited to the banquet when the women's team had been invited. Women's rugby in the USA had a distinct culture. Whilst rugby generally had a large counterculture element with heavy drinking and general rowdiness a large part of its sporting culture, unlike in traditional rugby nations, it was not unusual for women's rugby teams to be completely separate from their male counterparts, apart from at large tournaments such as New York Sevens. Mixed rugby tournaments were simultaneously a safe and unsafe space to be a woman. Men's rugby had strong misogynistic factions, with sexual assault and homophobic attacks common at tournaments and gatherings, whilst rugby advertising often used degrading images of women with men in positions of power. At the same time, women's rugby was widely known and often derided for its accepting culture. Many female rugby players were queer, referred to in code as raging feminists by the media, and women's rugby teams were often places of refuge for young queer people. Many teams were subversive and openly twisted the ideals of femininity and misogynistic culture with team names such as the Eugene Housewives. The traditions of being both subversive and a queer refuge have continued until the current era, with clubs and teams across the United States widely denouncing USA Rugby's trans ban. Whilst the team that played at the 1991 Rugby World Cup was not the most internationally experienced team, they were incredibly well developed. In just under 2 decades, not only had teams and leagues developed, but administrators and advocates had developed networks and systems. Women were not just on the pitch, but they were forcefully integrating with their male factions at USA Rugby and even refereeing games. In small pockets of the country, such as Fairfax, Virginia, teenage girls were picking up the sport in their high schools. Coinciding with the signing of Title IX and its rollout, women and girls were given the chance to play instead of just watching. With close to no investment or even existing male infrastructure, women's rugby in the USA was perhaps the most developed in the world at the 1991 Rugby World Cup. Whilst it surprises men's rugby fans in 2026 that the USA won the first ever Women's Rugby World Cup, in 1991 it came as no shock to anyone in the women's rugby sphere that the USA took home the gold. I wrote this postscript whilst rather fittingly watching the NCAA Women's Basketball National Championship game on my sofa in the UK on Disney+. This post required me to do a lot of background research on Title IX, something which I'd seen mentioned in passing frequently but never fully explained. Whilst Title IX didn't directly impact rugby massively during the early days, it did help transform women's sport in the US during the 1970s. If you'd like more regular updates, please check out my Instagram, Twitter and/or Blue Sky. You can also catch me podding every Tuesday morning with Rap, or rather more sporadically with Women's Rugby Treehouse. I recently had a good chat with my friend Hugh about class and rugby, which you can find on his channel, HG Rugby. And a written version of this post can obviously be found on my website, therugbyhistoryproject.com, which is also where you can find all my references, footnotes, random thoughts. You can also upgrade to Historian tier to help support me and pay for things and books, etc. Like this one, No Advantage Given by Kerry Heffernan. Out now. Not Spawn, but if you want Spawn, Spawn.